In explaining how I came to the point of writing this book, I want to talk a little bit about a number of aspects of my teaching and also my research. So the first thing that I should explain is that I specialize in English Renaissance literature, but I have particular interest in lyric poetry, that is, short poems that typically focus upon intense personal emotional states, and women's writing, as Maria has explained. And women's writing goes back much further in literary history than most people realize. When I started the research project that turned into this book, which you see here, Gender, Sexuality, and Material Objects in English Renaissance Verse, I had several different pedagogical and academic concerns on my mind. In my role as a university professor, I had noticed how, at the beginning of the semester, my undergraduate students often had certain assumptions about Renaissance poetry. Many of them tended to take for granted that reading Renaissance poetry would mean reading love sonnets by male authors, especially Shakespeare, in what they considered to be exceedingly difficult, antiquated English, and that part maybe I'll concede. They also frequently assumed that Renaissance poetry would ultimately confirm exactly what they already thought they knew about love. That is, that it's always good and generous and sweet and kind and relatively chaste. There are ways in which these notions have a kernel of truth, of course, but they're also limiting and distorting. Male-authored love sonnets constitute a very important subset of the rich, diverse field of Renaissance poetry, but they're just one subset. Renaissance poetry on the theme of love expresses the full range of possible ideas concerning love, sweet, wholesome, passionate ideas, but also scary, mean-spirited, explicitly lustful, sometimes vengeful, even downright hateful ones. Furthermore, Renaissance poetry covers an impressively wide range of topics, not just love. And finally, men and women both wrote poetry during the Renaissance, not just men. So those are some of the pedagogical concerns I had in approaching this project. And I'm going to pause just for a second here to show you some pictures, because people often like pictures. And the first set of pictures I'm going to show you are some manuscript verse. What you're actually looking at are unfortunately not the best possible copies because they're photocopies that I purchased from the archives. And so what I do is I go to places like the Bodleian Library in Oxford and the British Library in London, and I look at the unique manuscript copies. But as you can see, this slide, which is taken from a photocopy of the original, is very hard to read. The original is too. In this case, in this manuscript, this is from a fairly early 16th century manuscript, and as you can see, the page is quite messy because it's got a number of different kinds of texts on it. And the one I'm interested in here, you can actually barely make out as words. It's the one here in this corner, which is fairly likely to be a female-authored poem addressed probably to another woman. That one's from the Bodleian Library, and it's called Farewell That Was My Love So Dear. So that's one example. This is a late 16th century example. In this case, it's a much longer poem, but I was interested in this tiny little thing down here, which is a poem in and of itself. "'Tis true I weep, I sigh, I wring my hands." 'Tis true, sometimes that happens. And the E that you have here, which may be fairly clear to most of you, is the signature of Eleanora Finch, who was a member of the Wyatt family. And so this is from a familial collection of poetry, probably collected in this case in the wake of her death. So there are also elegies to her along with poems that she wrote. And the next one, this is a mid-17th century example. And again, we've got several different kinds of things. This is another family collection. The poem I was interested in is unfortunately the messy one at the bottom down here. Unfortunate for me. This entire part here is the title. So there's a very, we'll just call it the sister's New Year's gift for the moment. One of the interesting things about this one is that at the very bottom of the page, this odd-looking thing is actually where she drew a picture of a heart instead of writing the word heart in the manuscript. That's the sort of thing you completely miss or can't represent correctly when you use a printed text. Right? So she says, "I have but this heart, and I can give no more. And so I can give but this," and then this weird little thing's a heart. Then it continues. This was a very long poem. So if you flip to the next one, all of this is the continuation of that poem that started at the bottom of the page. In this case, Elizabeth Cromwell's the author. She was writing it to her sister, a sister's New Year's gift, and her niece is the one who collected these family writings. So it was her niece's book. And then there's one more. This is a mid-17th century example. Part of the reason why this one is so tidy looking is because a family of aristocrats. The Cavendish family owned it, and the secretary of the family is the one who wrote this fair copy. This was written by Jane Cavendish in the 1640s. It's a Thanksgiving letter in the form of a poem to her father. Her father was exiled. He was out of the country at the time, but had given her a number of presents, and she's thanking him for the presents. So I became interested in performing more research on the sorts of Renaissance poems that would help my undergraduates become exposed to a much fuller range of what people really wrote, like these kinds of things, so that I could bring that research into the classroom. In my archival work on manuscript lyrics in the Bodleian Library in Oxford and the British Library in London, I started paying more attention to poems I came across that focused thematically upon matters other than the most commonplace love scenarios. That means love scenarios don't drop out, but I started looking for the ones that weren't the most conventional ones. In particular, I encountered a great many fascinating poems foregrounding different kinds of objects. Houses, great and small, and in a few minutes I'll show you a picture of some of those. Beautifully landscaped gardens and spectacular fountains. Beloved pets and farm animals. Good wine, abundant food. A severed finger. A divine foreskin. A well-placed chamber pot. And I'm not making that up. That one begins, hail serviceable utensil. Mid-17th century, collected by university students. Some of these poems still dwell upon matters of love. After all, love in all of its forms is an endlessly complex and engaging subject matter. But they make these objects central to questions of human affection and desire in unexpected, intriguing ways. At the same time that I started to think about how to make my teaching more representative of the full range of what poets actually wrote, scholars in Renaissance studies were focusing upon what we call material culture. Many scholars, for example, were analyzing Shakespeare's plays in relation to the material conditions of theatrical production during his lifetime. They were performing research to trace the multiple paths through which money flowed in and around the production of plays. They were examining how the cloth industry and systems of court patronage related to the use of magnificent costumes to bring characters to life. They were revising long-held ideas about the kinds of material things that could be found littering the stage as props during a performance. As more studies were published on Renaissance material culture, I noticed that most of them were about drama, particularly Shakespeare's plays, or visual art, especially lavish, expensive portraits of rich aristocrats. I also noticed that very few studies focused upon women's cultural contributions or upon any literary genre other than drama, and I increasingly directed my own research to address this gap in the scholarship. So this is what I went on to do then. By contextualizing poems, like these, disseminated in manuscript and print in relation to legal theories, autobiographies, biographies, plays, and epics, my book illustrates the range of ways in which poets conceptualize relations among people and things, human and non-human, subjects and objects. It focuses primarily upon what we can learn about women in the material world by studying their verse alongside that of their male contemporaries. It thus examines verse by canonical poets, such as Shakespeare, Robert Herrick, and John Donne, people that you may well have heard of, but it also discusses poems by George Aglionby, Richard Flecknoe, and William Cavendish. George Aglionby? Anybody? No? Similarly, it analyzes works by Margaret Cavendish, Lucy Hutchinson, and Amelia Lanier, who are by now canonical women poets to those of us who study the Renaissance. But it does so alongside those by Margaret Howard, Elizabeth Cromwell, and Francelina Stapleton, again, names that folks are very unlikely to have heard, even in the field of Renaissance studies. The poems I study are centrally concerned with gemstones, diamonds, rubies, pearls, and unspecified jewels, joint rings, enameled rings, memorial rings, jet rings, gold rings, hair bracelets, necklaces, combs, fans, carcanets, gloves, mourning clothes, portraits, hands, hearts, foreskins, children, flowers, gardens, galleries, closets, religious cells, prison cells, houses, and land. Although these material items sound quite diverse when listed together this way, they fall into two categories: love tokens and real estate. Maybe this says more about me in terms of what I found. In my archival research in Oxford and London, I discovered that men and women alike wrote a substantial number of poems, particularly when one includes manuscript verse, focused thematically upon the exchange of a wide variety of material items used as love tokens, and upon real property. So basically, it's because I found a lot of poems that were written about these things by men and women both that I chose to focus the book on these items. If I had written the book entirely on men's poetry or entirely on poetry that was printed, the objects probably would have been different. Okay, so this is what I got out of the archive. So now I'm going to show you some more pictures to give you a sense of why somebody might start writing poetry about real estate in England. So all of these pictures are actually of the same place. This is Penshurst Place. Penshurst was a very famous country house. So it's a family estate where aristocrats were living. To us, although it's called a country house, it may seem like a small palace in terms of sort of American thinking about these sorts of things. And a man named Ben Jonson, who is a contemporary with William Shakespeare, wrote a poem called To Penshurst to celebrate this piece of property. And although that was probably not the first country house poem in the English language, enough people read his poem To Penshurst that it was widely imitated, and other people also ended up writing about this exact same piece of property as well. So if we could look at the next slide, here's the castle, and here's a wall with some of the flowers up front. This is just kind of giving you a view of gardens plus the house itself, and we can go through these fairly quickly. There's a better image of the house and one of the gardens. I wanted to show you guys this one because looking through this window, and I have another one of it as well, you can kind of see into the countryside past the wall of one of the gardens, and it gives you a sense of the massive tracts of land that surrounded this kind of house, and also to give you a sense of why people would write poetry about this kind of thing. There would be a series of gardens all around these houses. They were highly ornamented and had sculptures and fountains and so forth, and so the houses themselves were also very aesthetic. And that's part of the reason people would want to write about them. Also more on the gardens here. And this is not a terribly impressive fountain, but it gives you a sense of the distance that created by just the number of sort of different styles of gardens between the house and just where we happen to be standing here, right? So that it's kind of like almost like a series of little rooms, the kinds of gardens that are between us and the house. All right, so at least that gives you a sense of the kind of, when I say people were writing about real estate, that's the kind of real estate I